welcome back to Reading the Weird. This is the third part of Bringing Home the Stars by Jennifer Kirk. I'm Zoe Kirk-Robinson and I'm going to be reading it for you today. If you haven't seen the first two parts yet, then they are available through the annotations that are above me. But for now, we're just going to get on with part 3. Zoe and Deza took the lift down as far as it would go, ignoring the skeletons at their feet. Perhaps there had been a mass panic. With only so many life pods available, and maybe with life support going offline, the darkest of human nature may have kicked in. There was likely a reasonable explanation for the bodies. It was hard to ignore, though, that the pattern of damage suggested it had happened from outside. With shredded panels on 3 sides, the inside of the doors was strangely undamaged, indicating that they had been open at the time whatever had killed those two on the floor and trashed the interior had occurred. When the lift reached the bottom floor, there was a moment's pause before the doors rumbled open. They strained to see through the darkness. Deza looked down at the blipping lights on the scanner. The atmosphere isn't looking too good. High carbon monoxide and a few other nasties. There may be coolant gases leached up from the engineering. I'm not entirely sure. The scanner's showing compounds I've never heard of before. He flicked on his helmet light and the beam stabbed out into the darkness. Bulkheads and decks showed in the beam, but fittings and panels hung loose, battered and distorted by ancient gunfire. Debris lay thick on the floor, with evidence of intense fires and burning. There had been intense fighting here, with small arms damaged in evidence, but it had been a long time ago. Dust had settled over everything in a thin, undisturbed layer that muted the destruction. "Explosives and gunfire," said Zoe. Deza nodded. "Looks like fires too, probably cooked off from grenades. We're going to have to go carefully." Zoe gingerly stepped over the bodies and out of the lift, flicking on her helmet beam. "I think we can say we've found where those two came from," she said, looking back at the skeletons. Deza followed slowly but said nothing. He wondered whether the decks above might have been the scene of similar fights. What could have been the reason? Broken and bent metal crunched underfoot. In some places explosive rounds had eaten deep into the plating and ripped holes through into adjacent rooms, even to the deck below. They stopped and shone a light down through one hole in the floor. The beam disappeared into a hazy mist. Ghostly shapes of machinery and equipment coalesced only faintly beyond broken walkways. The scanner showed that there was moisture in the air, as well as a cocktail of other chemicals. "That's certainly where we need to head," said Zoe. "It looks like the first level of the engineering spaces. There must be an access staircase somewhere. It could be hard to find in all this mess. We'll manage." It happened so fast, neither realized before it was too late. The deck shuddered beneath them, throwing them both to one side. Scrabbling for handholds, Zoe's gloved hand found a twisted plate that held. Deza's hands grasped frantically at material that held briefly before breaking apart, annihilated by a firefight in the distant past. They felt the vibrations of rending steel as much as they heard the dull bass rumble. The floor sagged, then fell through. Deza slid with it. From her suit radio she heard a cry, then a thump and a staccato of static as he hit the deck somewhere in the gloom below. "Deza, are you okay?" She heard herself gasp into the radio as she worked to haul herself back onto the firm deck plates. "Deza?" she asked again. She turned and surveyed the corridor. Some of the deck was much weaker than it had looked. Damaged by small arms fire, it had given up under their combined weight and fallen through. She cursed herself for not being more careful. With nearly a decade of deep space salvage experience behind her, she should have known better. It seemed the excitement of a big payday, coupled with Tubbs' unsettling fears, had got to them a little and made them careless. Bracing herself in case the metalwork gave further, she crept along the floor to the broken edge and peered over. Turning her helmet beam to full, she studied the ghostly shapes of machinery through the humid mist that swirled now and the turbulence that had been set up. It took her only a moment to see where Deza had landed. His white suit shone against the grey backdrop. "Deza!" Relief washed over her as she saw him move and sit upright. He was lucky to not have landed square on something too sharp. Static hissed on the radio in several bursts. Deza was waving to her. Was there a problem with his suit? Finally, a weak voice came across the static. "Zoe, copy." "Deza," she called back, relief awash in her voice. "That was close, but the suit communicator is broken. All that seems to work is the short band. As long as I have line of sight, I can talk to you. All the other systems appear to be working okay. I can still breathe," he said, surprisingly cool and calm considering his near miss. "It's going to be tough getting you out of there. I'm going to call Tubbs down here to help." "He won't like that." "Blast his superstitious mumbo-jumbo. He's going to have to get down here if he wants us back off this hulk." Tubbs muttered expletives as he waited for the airlock to cycle. There was an atmosphere in the Starliner, he knew, but Zoe had warned that for some, as yet unknown reason, it was variable and they did not want to contaminate the tug's environment. Lights pinged to green, and he shouldered aside the hatch and switched on his helmet lamp. His heart rate notched up as the beam stabbed into the darkness, picking out the dusty corridor. Zoe had been pretty precise with her instructions, but he could see the footprints left in the accumulated dust. All he had to do was follow the trail. The light at the bottom of the stairwell was unnerving. It was not right, he thought, for a derelict to still have lights working like this. It gave him a funny feeling that the original occupants had not quite left yet. He felt his heart in his throat as he glanced nervously around, half expecting to see people flitting at the periphery of his vision. But there were none. What was worse, imagining people, or there actually being people? He tried not to think about it. The atrium felt odd when he reached it. So much open space, with stars visible through the canopy above. He didn't like it. Following the trail, he hurried down the grand staircase. It was easy enough to move around in the suit, and it was a great help that the Starliner's gravity field generators still seemed to be working. He wondered how long could a fusion reactor continue running at minimal power with no overseeing. They usually required round-the-clock supervision, but it was conceivable that if no faults occurred, and with a plentiful supply of fuel, they could keep running unhindered for decades. He pressed the elevator call button and felt the sweat in his suit as the elevator indicator began moving. Again he heard the little voice in his mind telling him that this was not right. What would be in the lift when it arrived? As it turned out, absolutely nothing. The car that arrived was not the one the others had used. He could tell by the tracks. Inside, its lights were on. He reeled back in fear as he caught sight of movement, then cursed himself when he realized it was only his own reflection in the mirrored wall at the rear. With his visor down and his oversized helmet, he looked almost like an alien. He jabbed the button. It took a moment for the doors to close. Not liking the idea of having his back to the door, he moved to the back and waited. As the doors slid shut, his heart leapt in fear. He thought he saw something move, over there in the shadows behind the husks of long-gone vegetation on the ground level of the atrium. It was just a quick glance, and one that left him uncertain that he really saw it at all. Too late now, as the doors sealed themselves shut. A rasping noise filled him with even more dread, until he realized it was only the sound of his own breathing echoing within the helmet. He chastised himself with letting his fears get the better of him. He tried to think that Zoe and Dez's scoffing at his tale had been with reason, and that he was working himself up over nothing. But it was hard to shake the subconscious fears running amok through his mind. The lights in the elevator flickered as it jutted to a halt. A loose connection somewhere, he thought, trying to reassure himself. The derelict Starliner must be riddled with loose connections and blown circuits. It was still unnerving to him, though, in his present state. Strangely, the corridor he emerged on was well lit. This was not how Zoe had described it. The floor was dusty, and when he looked along the line of elevator doors, he saw that there were no footprints. "Shit," he exclaimed under his breath. "Wrong deck." Shuffling back inside the elevator car, the flickering was getting worse. He fancied he could almost hear the sound of circuits shorting under the strain of their first use in almost a century. He jabbed a button, expecting the doors to close and the car to ride down one more level. Nothing happened. He jabbed again, this time a little harder. The lights on the panel flickered once, then died. The carriage lights came back on, somewhat brighter, but it was clear that something in the old electronics had finally expired. Getting back out of the car, he tried the call button in the corridor, hoping that another car would come and he could use that. Nothing happened. With a sinking feeling, he realized the controls on this deck had shorted out. The elevators were useless. He would have to find another way. Trying to calm his fear, he began searching the corridor. There had to be a staircase somewhere close by. There usually was one near elevators in case of emergencies. The corridor was well lit for maybe 20 meters. After that, the lights had failed for another 20 before coming back on again. He could see the corridor going on and on into the distance. Looking in the other direction, more of the lights were out in the same way. "Try and keep to the light for now," he muttered to himself, and headed on, checking door handles as he went. Most were locked, and he guessed from their brass panels that they were most likely passenger cabins. The electronic locks were all latched into the secure position. Probably it was another circuit that had failed at some time. They were of no concern now. If Zoe's scheme to salvage the Starliner worked, then someone else at a spaceport could go through them. One door opened into a linen closet with shelves of sheets of towels piled high, dulled by dust. How strange it felt to be exploring this place. It felt more like any hotel on Earth than a floating derelict in deep space. All the other doors, as far as the dark patch, were locked. He plucked up the courage to move on and reached for his helmet light. Its beam flickered for a moment, then grew a little brighter. He tapped its controls and saw with a sinking feeling that battery power was low. Had he forgotten to charge it after the last time he used it? He didn't tend to go outside so often, and it was a while since he could remember using it. He turned it off, mindful that he would need what was left of the charge to get him back to the tug. This was only 20 meters of darkness. He was sure he could cope with that. It was strange just how quickly the darkness enveloped the walls and the floor. He could see the lights ahead of him, and if he looked over his shoulder, the lights behind him too. But here, without the aid of his helmet light, it was hard to see much. There would be doors somewhere, but he did not feel like groping in the dark. He could feel the fear rising in him, like a panic attack about to happen. He could not go on. Fumbling for his suit radio, he called through to Zoe. "I've got out on the wrong deck. The elevator panel failed. Can you send a car up for me?" He was relieved to hear Zoe's voice come over the static. "Tubbs, you sound awful. Where are you?" "Deck above you, I think." Static hissed loudly in his ear and he grimaced. "Say again? You're breaking up," he interrupted. Her voice came again, but it was even more muffled by static and sounded squelchy. He checked the radio power, thinking he might have forgotten to charge that too, but the meter showed it was nearly full. In the darkness, a light flickered, and from the corner of his eye he saw something moving. Wheeling around, something tapped against him. He screamed as his fear overwhelmed him. Zoe heard the scream through the static. "Tubbs, answer me!" The scream had ended as fast as it had begun. Now there was nothing. She tried again, but there was only static. "What's happened?" asked Desert on the short range channel. "Something's up with Tubbs. I heard a scream on the radio, and now he's not answering. He's been jumpy since we talked about boarding this thing. Probably scared himself with his own shadow. I had to go find him. He sounds serious. Can you hold on?" "Sure. I'll bide my time exploring down here. I'll just follow the conduit toward the reactor and see what's cooking in there. Scanner readings show that from the radiation it can't be too far from here." "Okay, just stay close to here so I can get you out as soon as I've got Tubbs." Tubbs had said that he had thought he was on the deck above. Moving back to the elevators, she looked up at the indicators. Sure enough, one of the cars was showing where he had reckoned he was. She used the car that she and Deza had written down in. If Tubbs' comments on electrical faults were true, then at least she knew that this one worked. It took only a few seconds for the car to reach the next floor. She ignored the two skeletons at her feet. She would have to figure out a way to get Tubbs past them. As the doors slid open, she saw the lights were on here. She flicked off her helmet light and stepped out. She could not see him, but a trail of footsteps in the dust told her where he had been. Glancing into his open elevator, she saw that the electronics were fried. She tried calling him on the radio, but there was nothing but background static. Did he have a radio problem? His footsteps led toward a patched corridor where the lights were out. From the look of the trail, he had been trying the doors on the way. A light flickered momentarily, and she thought she saw him. "Tubbs?" The radio channel remained silent. The lights flickered again, and she saw him stood motionless, shoulders hunched. "Tubbs, don't screw around with me." She flicked on her helmet light, and the beam stabbed out. It was Tubbs. She walked the last few meters, muttering to herself, and grabbed his arm. His arm twisted, and he floated round, rising a little off the floor. She gasped before she realized that she too was rising off the floor. Something moved at the edge of the beam. She looked over so the beam picked it out. A small, carved wooden ornament hung in the air, rotating in the patch of zero gravity. The gravity generators must have failed in this section of the corridor. "Tubbs," she repeated again in earnest. She felt her heart rate notch up and knew something was wrong. Fear clawed her mind. Checking Tubbs' suit readouts, she realized that he must have blundered into the floating ornament in the dark and died of a heart attack. He had never had time to realize there was nothing more than another failed circuit on the Starliner. She refused to believe he could be dead and tried the readings all over again. Maybe the suit was malfunctioning. She felt for a pulse, but the suit's fabric made it almost impossible. "Shit, Tubbs, how could you be so spooked?" she muttered, and battered the ornament away. It floated on evenly until it passed into the light and fell like a stone to the dusty carpet. How long had it hovered because of failed circuits before Tubbs had arrived? No one would know. She tried the radio again before realizing that Deza could not answer. "Come down, Zoe," she told herself. trying to regulate her breathing. Think logically. Clinging on to the hope that Tubbs might be merely unconscious, she knew she had to get him back to the lift and find Deza for his help. It proved difficult to get Tubbs to the lift. As soon as she reached the working gravity field, his body fell like a stone, and she had to drag him the rest of the way. It took longer than she thought, but finally they made it, and she rode the elevator back down. The doors clattered open, and she recoiled in shock. The beam from Deza's helmet light stabbed into the lift as he pushed in. "Jesus, you scared me," she said angrily. "We have to go," he said over the static of the short-range link. He punched the button for the atrium level, and the door slid shut behind him. For the first time he saw Tubbs' body on the floor and looked taken aback. "What happened?" "He freaked out because of a gravity failure. His suit readouts are dead. We need to get him back for medical aid." He knelt at Tubbs' side, and the elevator began to rock on the climb to the upper decks. Gingerly checking the readouts, he reset the suit's controls, but each time Zoe saw the readouts flatline. Finally, he shook his head and stood up. "There's nothing we can do." "Of course there is," she pleaded. We can't just leave him." "We can come back." "Back?" she said, taken aback. "What do you mean? Why do we have to leave?" "Problems in the engine spaces." "What do you mean?" "I think I've found the reason the Cerberus is lying here derelict. We have to leave now." She stood her ground. "I'm not leaving Tubbs. He comes with us." Deza held her suit with a tightness that almost began to scare her. She made to protest, but his voice was calm on the radio channel. "Look, we can't help Tubbs, but we can help ourselves. There's something on this ship." She laughed, but he continued stubbornly. "If I'm wrong, and I hope I am, we can come back for Tubbs, but we have to move fast, and without a stretcher we are going to struggle to bring him along. Trust me, I don't want to leave a member of the crew any more than you do." She looked at his helmet. All she could see was the mirror reflection of herself, but she knew from his tone of voice that he was serious. She sighed and her shoulders drooped. "Okay, but we are coming back for Tubbs." In the deck below, Deza had decided to use the time to look around. There was no sense in wasting any just because Tubbs had got scared. Through the mist in the engineering spaces, he watched as Zoe's helmet light dipped then disappeared. Damn that Tubbs! Well, he had a little time to explore at least, and that was something they were going to have to do anyway. The scanner showed him that the levels and spread of radiation were consistent with the running fusion reactor core being at most 50 meters away. That wasn't far. Getting his bearings, he used his light to cut a beam along the walkway. Looking over the edge, he saw that the space went down a whole lot further than his helmet light could penetrate. He was lucky the deck had given way only where it had. The mist was thick down here. From the scanner's readouts, it was high in moisture and a whole lot of other weird chemistry. He suspected that some of it could have been a coolant leak from the reactor that had built up over time, but the radiation levels did not particularly support that theory. The walkway came to a bulkhead. There was a hatch through, which was shut, and the panel at the side glowed dimly. It rolled upwards effortlessly at the touch of a button, and he stepped through into the light of the next compartment. Blinking in the sudden brightness, he flicked off the helmet light and waited for his eyes to adjust. There was no misting in this compartment, and it felt somewhat warmer. He could feel the air temperature change through the material of his suit. The scanner showed that the air in here was breathable again, free of any of the toxic compounds that had saturated the last deck. Carefully, he turned off the recirculation system on his suit and popped open the visor for a sniff. It smelt a little sweet. There were traces of machine oil and a little ozone. He hated that smell. Nothing to worry about. At least this would save suit power while he was investigating. He wished that he could talk to Zoe, but the suit communications were still down. In the centre of the compartment there were 3 huge toroidal structures, the fusion reactor cores that would provide the power for the Starliner. 2 were dark and inactive, but the third glowed a deep shade of purple. The panels told him there was systemic damage to several systems. Someone had tried to smash up the controls. Why would anyone do that, he wondered. The computer terminals showed blank. The main system was offline. He noticed the panels alongside had been damaged, gouged by a blunt instrument, maybe an axe. Wires hung in a shorn loom, though on closer inspection the loom had pulled apart at a connector instead of shearing through. Whoever had tried to disable it had been in too much of a hurry to do a thorough job. Leaning down, he tested the connections with the probe from his scanner. There was still live power on the line. A thought occurred to him, and he grinned. What if he just connected it back up? It was worth a try. Lining up the connectors, he blew off the dirt and pushed them together. Nothing happened. Damn, something else must be wrong, he muttered. He wondered what it could be before noticing the screen had a blinking cursor at the top. Crashed out. scanned along the panel. Here the axe had been at work gouging into the fascia, but the damage seemed superficial. He found the switches he needed and flicked them one by one. The screen lit up and various logos appeared for a shipping line that he had never heard of. He felt a rise of excitement. The system was booting. Whilst he waited, he looked over some of the other panels. Some were so badly damaged that he could not even tell what they were for, whilst others seemed to have been simply switched off. Finding the controls for the Starliner's power grid, he flicked open the relays and noted as lights blipped on across the schematic board. A red warning light told him there was an overload in the available power, and he fiddled with the adjacent console for the one still running reactor. He smiled. He was enjoying this. Maybe they could start up enough systems that they wouldn't need to tow. Maybe the Starliner could make the jump herself. Up in the power transfer, he heard the steady throb as the reactor stepped up from minimal power after decades of running almost on standby. It was working! "System ready," said a stilted feminine voice. He spun around in shock at the sound of the woman's voice. Adrenaline pumped. For a moment, he could not place where it might have come from. Then he realized it was the computer's voice unit and breathed a sigh of relief. "Hey Hal, how's it going?" he said. "Unknown order. Repeat," replied the computer in an accent that sounded old and archaic. He ignored the voice and typed quickly on the keyboard. It was easier than trying to hold down a conversation that seemed so eerie on a floating derelict. Bringing up the log, he saw that the last official entry was nearly 90 years ago. So Tubbs had guessed right on the timeline. Mostly it was mundane, but as he read he noticed that there were other entries, made both by the crew and by the computer's automated recording system. File after file rode onto the screen. The more he read, the more concerned he grew. The crew had sabotaged the ship before they had tried to make a break in the life pods, but it had not quite been an act of madness. The logs talked about a stellar fog that the Starliner had passed through no more than 12 hours previous. It seemed to have knocked them from the Rosen Bridge. Before they could reattempt the jump, the crew had become convinced that the fog had contaminated the electrical systems with something. He read the description, then reread it. It almost didn't make sense, but the pattern of damage on the Starliner told him that the crew had certainly believed it. They had encountered some kind of entity. It had entered the systems and began somehow killing the passengers. "Oh shit," he whispered. The myth was true. At the reactor panel, he tried to shut down the systems he'd started up. The crew had almost succeeded. Turn off all the systems and the entity would die, the logs said. They had almost managed it. Forced into some kind of hibernation, the Starliner had drifted for nearly 90 years, with something sleeping within it. They had to get away now. The panel would not respond. No matter what he pressed, the reactor kept on running. Lights flickered across other consoles as system after system began to wake up. How was the Starliner suddenly able to power up things that had been offline for decades? Then it hit him. The computer! He returned to the computer panel. How did it all switch off? He remembered the connector he had pressed home and leant underneath to pull it apart. Intruders detected. Dispatch security to engineering to apprehend. He reeled back before he could pull the plug with the words spoken with absolute calm by the female voice. It filled him with a feeling of unease, and he panicked. "Oh shit," he hissed, and ran. He found the stairwell and used it. He knew he had to get up to meet Zoe, and fast. The stairs were well lit, and the first doorway brought him out into the corridor in which the floor had given way. The lights were still out, but his helmet light illuminated the way. He almost forgot about the foul air until the scanner started blipping in warning. Stopping only to slam shut the visor, he powered up the suit's recirculation system as he ran. At the elevators, all doors were shut, but one showed us starting to descend from the floor above. Was this Zoe? It had to be. Now he wondered about how much substance there was in the computer's threats. He knew he had no time to hesitate, and he must take a risk. He waited for the doors to open, then piled into the car. Lights were on all over the ship as they hurried back up the grand staircase in the atrium. Through the canopy above, they could see more running and navigation lights blinking on. The ship was powering up. They paused only a moment as the sound of klaxons began to wail. "What the hell is that?" demanded Zoe. Before Deza could say anything, a calm female voice began calling out in a pre-recorded loop. "Intruder alert. Dispatch security to decks C to G." "Security?" Deza pushed her on. "I don't think we should wait to find out." The airlock corridor was bright with lights when they arrived, and the airlock door stood ajar. They paused in the corridor, uncertain of what to expect inside. "Tubbs, when he came to find us?" asked Zoe. "I'd like to think so." They slipped through the opening and pulled it shut behind them, sealing the levers as quickly as they could. In the brilliant whiteness of the airlock, lights were flashing. Impatiently, they waited for the air to cycle, then stripped off their helmets. "What's going on?" "The core," replied Zoe after thinking a moment. "Tubbs said it was heading out of alignment because of a power spike on the docking link." The colour drained from their faces as they realised the significance. Hurrying through the tug, they headed straight to the bridge, still in their suits. There was no time to change. They leapt behind the consoles and Zoe keyed on the computer. "Power spiking. Tubbs was right. Detaching now." The tug rocked and more warning lights blipped across the consoles. Clamps won't let go. Desert punched up on the ion drive. "They will with a bit of brute force." "That could compromise the hull," wailed Zoe. "Would you rather just sit here and wait for the core to fail?" asked Desert in a cool and calm voice. She gave it a moment's thought. "Do it." The tug shuddered as the drive power built up. On monitors, the view of the airlock showed up as a glowing orange as the ion particle stream from the exhaust cones bounced off the Starliner's hull. Then, with a rending of metal, the stanchions broke free and the tug jerked out into space. Warning lights and buzzers wound down one by one. Checking off on the readouts, it was clear that the core was stabilizing now. They both watched the receding bulk of the Starliner through the screen. "What now?" asked Zoe. Before he could answer, the Starliner appeared to flicker for a moment, then disappear in a bright flash. Gauges on consoles blipped and buzzers squawked again briefly before returning to normal. "Rosenbridge jump," said Desert slowly, almost unable to believe the readouts on his screen. "You mean the Starliner just made the jump on its own? Where to?" "I don't know." "What about Tubbs? We never went back for Tubbs." "We did all we could." "But Tubbs," she stammered. A tear rolled from the corner of her eye. "No one is ever going to believe this happened. They're going to blame us for not going back for him. That is, if we can still get to civilization any time this month," said Desert. "We still have a drive core to realign or we are going nowhere. We just lost Tubbs and the biggest payday we could ever have had." Without waiting for her answer, he slipped from his chair and walked off the bridge. "I'm going to change," he called back. "This suit still stinks of that Starliner." "What do you think that was?" asked Zoe tearfully. Desert thought for a moment. "I think," he said at last, "we don't ever want to know." Well, that's the opening short story of Bringing Home the Stars by Jennifer Kirk. It's a full novel, but it starts with an opening short story. If you want to read more, it is available from the link in the description bar below, and there is a sequel as well, Twinkle Little Star, so if you like it, and I think you will, there's that as well. But until next time, thank you very much for watching. If you did like this, remember to click the like button, share it with your friends so that they can read a good book too, and do subscribe for future videos because there will be more in the future. But until next time, I've been Zoe Kirk-Robinson, you've been watching Reading the Weird on ZJKR, and I'll see you next time.